Hello everyone. It looks like we finally got some new Tears of the Kingdom footage. And we got a whole bunch of it too, finally detailing some of the new abilities that we'll be playing around with in the new game. And there's a million videos, I'm sure, already talking about various theories about how these abilities might work or what other abilities might be in the game and other various things like that. But what I felt like talking about today is how I think that these abilities are designed to address some of the problems and criticisms with Breath of the Wild. So to give a disclaimer up front, I will admit that Breath of the Wild is kind of one of my favorite games of all time. But I can still see where a lot of the criticisms are coming from. And I can even agree with a lot of them to at least a lesser extent. I may not view them to such a harsh degree as some people may point them out to be, but I can at least see where they're coming from, and I can see how they can be a little annoying from time to time, but I do still think that regardless of how severe you think these problems are, I do think that Tears of the Kingdom is at least attempting to address these issues with these new abilities and how they're designed. So let's stop speaking in generalities and just dive right into the big one right up front, and that is, of course, weapon durability. Now, weapon durability, I think, got probably the most flack out of any of the systems in Breath of the Wild. And I can definitely understand where people are coming from with this one, because frankly, people just don't like having their things break. And in most games, I would usually agree, but in Breath of the Wild, I feel like the game was very specifically designed around weapons breaking, because if they didn't, then you just stick with the same weapons for basically the entire game and only replace them once you found a weapon of the same type that you liked but had a higher damage number. There'd be a lot less reason to actually try to cycle through different weapons, and you lose a lot of the improvisational aspect to it. It can be kind of stressful to manage, of course, but I feel like that improvisation is a very key point of how Breath of the Wild works, and it encourages players to try different things rather than trying to just do the same thing over and over again, which would get very boring after 200 hours. So, of course, in Tears of the Kingdom, some people were hoping they would get rid of weapon durability entirely, but it's clearly still here to stay. And like I said, Tears of the Kingdom is being built off of Breath of the Wild, and in Breath of the Wild, weapon durability is just too integral to how the game is designed to simply remove it wholesale without changing how a lot of other systems work. But we also see the new fuse ability and how it's able to take two weapons or even just random objects in the environment and a weapon and combine them together to create a new weapon. And this new weapon seems to have a lot more durability than a simple weapon on its own. We see in the trailer that he takes a stick that breaks after only a handful of hits, combines it with the rock, and now he's able to swing it around like a hammer with no sign of it breaking anytime soon. I'm sure it'll break eventually, but it does sort of give people that ability to repair a damaged weapon that they like, and even upgrade it and enhance it with another weapon or object or whatever you want to combine it with, that I think will help take some of the sting off of the weapon durability system. This way, if you do have a weapon you really like, you can use it to your heart's content, and then you can save it when it gets low on durability so that you can combine it with something so you get it all over again, and now you can combine that fire sword with... Actually, I'm curious how you might combine, like, elemental weapons together, if that creates something interesting, but... Regardless, the point being that, at the end of the day, I think that it'll help make the weapon durability a little bit less annoying for the people that didn't like it in the first game. But at the end of the day, if you just simply don't like the idea of your weapons breaking at all, well, unfortunately, I don't think there's much that can really do about that in the way that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are being designed. But hopefully this takes some of the edge off. Moving on to the next big complaint, I think that probably the second biggest thing that people talked about in terms of criticizing the game after weapon durability was probably the climbing system overall. Now, don't get me wrong, I think most people liked the idea that you can climb anything, and the fact that you could climb just about everything in the game meant that there was a ton of freedom in how to approach things, and you could go to the top of all kinds of mountains all over the place. But as you got deeper into the game, the actual challenge of climbing things kind of became trivialized. Like, early on, it was a real decision that you'd have to make about, like, oh, I've only got like a circle and a half of stamina, and I need to estimate, like, is there a way that I can climb to the top of this cliff, and like maybe if I can find a rest spot, and so on and so forth. You know, it was actually an interesting challenge. But later on in the game, when you've got like 3 circles of stamina and a million different foods that can replenish all your stamina, and Rivali's Gale on top of that, climbing just kind of became a time sink, because you could basically guarantee that you could climb just about anything in the game, no problem. And so it just kind of became less and less interesting as the time went on. So like, that time spent climbing in the beginning of Breath of the Wild, I think is valuable and was interesting for its time, but once everybody played through that, there wasn't much more value to be extracted from it. And on top of that, there's of course the biggest annoyance of climbing, which is of course trying to climb a cliff in the rain, which is still possible if you know how to exploit the rhythm of when you fall and everything, but it just added a lot more time and made it more annoying to do, and it was often easier to just wait till the rain was over, and so on and so forth. So I don't think it needs to really be said that the ascend ability that lets you immediately go from the ground up through the ceiling to whatever is above it on the surface is a pretty clear replacement for essentially having to climb everything. Sure, you can't use it everywhere, to be fair, but it seems like a lot of the time, instead of having to climb all these really tall cliffs and everything, you could just walk into a cave, use this ascend ability, and then zoop up through the ceiling and out the top, and you'll be able to skip a lot of the time-consuming part and having to craft all those meals and everything for every single cliff that you'd want to climb up, at least once you got into that late to mid-game. So the ascend ability kind of helps speed things up a little bit and makes things a little bit easier to just kind of manage in the late game. However, there are a few other aspects of the ascend ability that I think are worth going into, if you'll permit me to scoot a little bit into the theory territory. So when he first showed off the ascend ability, I thought it was going to be hyper limited. Like, it seemed like it was only going to work if you were, say, inside a small structure where the ceiling and the roof above it was very close to each other. But then when they showed him using it in that tunnel that let you ascend all the way up through the ground to the top of a mountain, I thought it was going to be way too versatile. But now I've realized, after thinking about it for a little while, that I think it's somewhere in between, and it's kind of interesting how it interacts with the overworld and the Sky Islands. Because you see, the overworld is, I think, the main area where the ascend ability will be the most useful. And I think that makes sense, because as I was saying before, we've already climbed all over every inch of Breath of the Wild. So there's no real reason to require the player to do that all over again. So in the overworld, where there's probably going to be tons of mountains and various tunnels that you can use to ascend through those mountains, well, now you no longer have to climb all over those mountains all over again. You could just walk into a tunnel and immediately zoop up to the top. So I imagine even climbing up, say, Death Mountain probably won't be as much of a challenge as it was in the original Breath of the Wild. And sure, it'll have some uses in the Sky Islands, as they showed in the demo, but it's not like you can use it to go from the ground to the Sky Island, and I doubt there will be very many instances where you can go from one Sky Island to another. So it's very interesting how it's much more powerful on the overworld to help trivialize what we've already done, but it's not going to be as useful except for in very specific design situations like you'll see in the Sky Islands. But there's also one other use case that I thought of. Because you see, the ability only seems to go one way. You can only go up with it. So wouldn't it be interesting if, say, you were going in a tunnel and it was a really long tunnel, but you wanted to have the player be able to easily exit this tunnel at any time? Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that I think that this ability might hint towards a significant underground area presence in the game. We've already seen some hints towards it in some of the other trailers with areas that look like they were clearly in some kind of large cave system. But this Ascend ability would work perfectly with that because it means that you can go into the underground area as normal, but you would not be able to use this to do anything in that underground area except for leave it. So it acts as this perfect universal fast travel system to kind of get out of a sticky situation, or maybe if you're just lost in this huge underground network, you could just use it to immediately shoot back up to the surface and go on your merry way. But if you want to actually do something underground, you have to go back to the tunnel entrance and go all the way back through it again. So any kind of underground area would kind of be the perfect, way to incorporate this ability in the main game. And of course, that leads directly into one of the next biggest complaints about Breath of the Wild, which is the lack of true, proper Zelda dungeons. Sure, the shrines were great little self-contained puzzles, but they ended up looking very samey, and a lot of people complained about that. And similarly, the Divine Beasts, they were very dungeon-like, but again, the art style was very similar, they were fairly small and self-contained, without a ton of variety to them at the end of the day. And so, I think that if this Ascend ability really is hinting towards a significant underground presence, well, what is known for being a large, sprawling underground area? I honestly think that the way the Ascend ability is designed really heavily hints towards the presence of dungeons in this game, or at the very least, some kind of equivalent large underground networked area of puzzles and whatnot, which at the end of the day is effectively what a dungeon is. Now, to get away from the speculation territory a little bit, there's still a few more minor complaints that I think that these abilities will address and improve upon. And, for example, there's enemy variety. In Breath of the Wild, sure, you had plenty of different enemies with your various lizard things, and your moblins and bokoblins, and your Lynels and whatnot, but as the game progressed, you usually end up seeing most of the enemies in the game fairly early on, and then after that point, it was mostly just a matter of those enemies getting stronger. I don't think they even really got much better weapons, more based on just their location. It was just that they would hit harder and have a lot more health and various things like that. Like a gold Lynel would be super scary compared to just a normal one, but still fundamentally the same enemy. Whereas, I think that the fact that enemies can also have fused weapons, just like Link, well, in the same way that the fused weapons represent a potentially exponential amount of variety in combat for Link, well, the same applies to the enemies, that chances are the enemies will be using weapon combos that the player might not even think to use, because they're not limited by the player's thinking of trying to make the optimal choices, and so as a result, they may end up using completely off-the-wall, wacky weapon combos that maybe make no sense, but might still offer an interesting combat challenge in order to fight against. And then, on a somewhat similar note, I feel like the combat applications of these new abilities feels like they will scale a lot better to the end game. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that all these abilities are necessarily super powerful in combat, but I feel like their effectiveness in combat won't really change as time goes on, if that makes any sense. What I mean by that is, like, for example, bombs in the original game were kind of decent early on because enemies simply had so little health, but they overall did a very small amount of damage, probably because you had an infinite number of them, and as a result, they were really useless later on. And Stasis, another very powerful and versatile ability, but using it actually on enemies was barely viable because even weak enemies wouldn't be stunned for very long, and strong enemies would be stunned for so little time that it basically didn't matter. But the Fuse ability offers a lot of combat variety with weapons, as I've already mentioned, and it seemingly do it on the fly pretty easily, so I could totally see people using it mid-combat to quickly fuse together a new weapon in order to fight a new group of enemies, and there's no reason why that wouldn't continue to be viable all the way up through the end game and potentially even during boss fights. And other various abilities, like the recall ability, seems like a much more interesting combat ability than stasis, because the problem with stasis is that it's too useful, potentially, in combat, if that makes sense. If you're able to stun even the strongest enemies for like 5 seconds, and then wail on them to send them flying across the map, well, that would just make combat trivial, so of course it made sense that they had to nerf it. But recall has some interesting properties that could still make it useful. Sure, you could use it like in one of the trailers where they recall a giant boulder to cause it to roll over enemies as it rolls back up the hill, and that could be useful, but also fairly situational. But I think it could be interesting if the recall ability can also be used on enemies. Now, maybe it can, maybe it can't. I guess this is kind of entering into speculation territory. But even if it can, unlike stasis, recall could still be used on stronger enemies without necessarily being any stronger. Because the main downside that would come with recalling an enemy to an earlier state is that you would presumably undo any damage you dealt to that enemy in that time. So it has a built-in weakness that makes it so that you can still recall strong enemies to be like, okay, I need a few seconds to back up and compose myself, so I'm going to recall this boss Lionel so that he goes back in time and he has to go back to where he was. But in turn, if I've hit him with a few attacks since then, well, now that damage is going to get undone, which makes that a much more interesting ability in combat. Add on top of that the fact that seemingly the absurd variety of items that you can now use with your arrows now means that there's not only a ton more variety in combat with those particular items and weapons, but you also might now finally have a use for a lot of the random items that otherwise you would collect but just kind of let pile up in your inventory. Sure, you could make potions out of monster parts, but in Breath of the Wild often you would collect so many monster parts that you'd have to be chugging potions 24/7 in order to actually go through them all. But adding these sort of pseudo-magical effects to various arrows, or potentially even weapons for all we know, gives you a lot of interesting variety and options to use these parts on that can actually give a real purpose for these parts. And so yeah, I think that mostly covers just about all the abilities that we at least know about so far. I'm sure that once we get our hands on the game, these abilities will prove to have even more potential uses that we simply don't know about yet, and there's probably more abilities than even the ones that we've seen so far, similar to how we got the various champion abilities in the first game after we got all the initial runes. And on top of that, there's probably some other things that these abilities can attest to as well, like for example, the fuse abilities, a power to lift and manipulate objects, seems like it's basically a version of magnesis that is no longer even limited to metallic objects anymore, which kind of seems absurd with how easily people broke the game with magnesis previously, but I guess we'll see exactly how that plays out in this game. But at the end of the day, I'm looking forward to this game, and I hope the people that had some complaints about Breath of the Wild will give this game a fair shot, because I think that they are still addressing a lot of those complaints. Even if they can't necessarily get rid of all of them, like I said, the weapon durability kind of has to stick around, but I still think that this is going to be a massive improvement on what was already a pretty excellent game. Thanks for watching.